Well, good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on recruitment and retention. As many of you know, CALEA is dedicated to providing resources to public safety agencies to support them in filling their mission. In today's rapidly evolving landscape, those responsible for delivering public safety services face tremendous business challenges. The public has high expectations not only for outcomes, but also for how the work is conducted and its impact on the community. While operational issues are always critical, successful organizations also ensure the establishment of sound policies and practices around administrative matters to support their primary mission. Over the past decade, attracting, employing, and retaining qualified personnel has been a significant challenge in the public safety industry. CALEA, with the support of our guest researchers today, have identified best practices around recruitment and retention from agencies that have attained CALEA accredited status, these representing the elite in the industry. We partnered with Dr. Joseph Schaefer and Dr. Julie Hibden to develop a methodology for collecting information on this topic, focusing on what has worked and how it might further support our agencies. While we may not provide a comprehensive solution today, we hope to stimulate more contemplation on the subject and foster further discussions about promoting public safety careers as honorable and important professions. Our guests for this webinar are the lead researchers on this project. Dr. Julie Hibden is an associate professor in the School of Justice and Public Policy at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, and she's also a CALEA commissioner since January of 2025. Dr. Joseph Schaefer is a professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University with numerous publications in the field of policing and public safety policy. Both Drs. Hibden and Schaefer are deeply committed to the success of public safety professionals. As we begin this facilitated discussion, we all agree that great agencies are composed of great people. Success is no accident, and it requires a perpetual search for human resources and talent that will propel agencies forward. In times of intense public scrutiny, having the right people employed and those serving in leadership positions is critical to the broad success of any organization. So I hope this introduction sets the stage for a productive and engaging panel discussion. As part of this work, Dr. Hibden and Dr. Schaefer have produced a white paper for your support, which may capture more information than we have time for today. So we encourage you to access this resource by scanning the QR code at the end of our presentation. Additionally, the URL has been copied into the chat feature of this link for your direct access to the work. So with that, Dr. Schaefer, could you give us a quick overview of how you and Dr. Hibden approached this research project and the methods you use to collect data? And I'm also interested in, you reference high success agencies for recruitment and promotion and outcomes. I'd like for you to give us some explanation about how to understand that term as it's presented.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you again, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. So Julie and I approached this project going on almost 2 years ago now, and the project emerged out of conversations that we had been having with CALEA staff, CALEA commissioners about the issue of recruitment and retention. And one of the things that we recognized in that situation is that CALEA agencies are somewhat unique relative to a lot of other organizations. You all provide regular data to CALEA on your recruitment efforts, on your selection and applications data, your agency composition, aspects of your community demographics, your promotion process. So CALEA agencies are really unique nationally in that they have a lot of important data for us to understand. So our starting point in this effort was to try to get an understanding of what CALEA client agencies were experiencing and seeing. We reached out to around 600 agencies in the summer of 2023, asking for the leader's permission to access that data for the purpose of this research. So even though you all turn over data tables and other information to CALEA on an annual basis, that is still your data, and CALEA's position is always that you have ownership, even though it technically might live in Simmers where we could access it. So about 220 agencies agreed to let us look at their data, and we looked in particular at the data tables from 2016 to 2022. Not all agencies out of those 220 were in the program the entire time, and that's okay. But we looked in particular at agency composition data, so the agency breakdown report, the agency demographic report, sworn officer selection, sworn officer promotions. And as Craig's question suggested, we tried then looking at that 7 or 8 years worth of data for 220 agencies to identify what we term high success agencies. Now, high success doesn't have a singular definition. There are different types of There are different definitions of success we may apply, and our definitions may not be relevant to what you all might define as success, and we recognize that. But in particular, we were looking for agencies that had a high rate of representation of female and non-white officers, who had a higher rate of hiring of female and non-white officers, who were promoting more female and non-white officers, and who were promoting representation from their sworn workforce and were hiring in representation of their service population. So we were looking at multiple definitions and dimensions across those 220 agencies. From that, we identified 61 agencies that we felt checked the box of high success on one or more of those recruitment and promotion practices. And we contacted the CEOs of those 61 agencies asking if the chief, the sheriff, the director, or their designee would be willing to be interviewed or have a conversation around what they were doing. So we heard ultimately from 36 agencies, 36 CEOs that agreed to participate. We did 16 interviews that focused on recruitment practices, 14 on promotion practices, and 6 that were focused on both of those issues. So in total, we have 22 interviews on recruitment, 22 on promotion. We also, in the summer and fall of 2023, ran 7 focus groups at the 2 CALEA conferences that were held in the summer and fall of 2023, inviting a broader cross-section of representatives to that conversation. So this was a little bit separate from those 220 agencies, but we sought to invite people that were representing by geography, by agency type, by sort of what we could discern about agency size, a good cross-section of agencies that were represented at those 2 conferences for a conversation that was focused on retention, challenges, best practices, things like that. And I'm quite confident that we today have a number of participants who were at those focus groups, whose agencies are represented in the 220 that provided us access to their data, or that were in those agencies that we interviewed, and likely even some folks who personally participated in those focus groups and interviews. So I want to acknowledge and thank all of those agencies and individuals that participated in this process. We appreciate the time and the insights you all shared. If you hadn't been willing to do that, we wouldn't have anything to share with you or talk about today.
The agencies were proud to share data in some ways, but it was a real pull to go through all the data that existed there. You had to protect the anonymity of the organization and also try to pull out information that could be useful for others. I think about that in terms of how research can be limited in some ways. As you talk about the methodology that was used, Joe, what would you say the limitations are, and what do you see as future steps maybe in some ways?
Yeah, and those are important questions. As researchers, we're always concerned about those limitations. We can't necessarily say that we have insights that represent all CALEA agencies. We can't necessarily say, as we talk today about some of these specific strategies, we can't conclusively connect the dots from those strategies to, again, kind of air quotes around high success. It's a little bit speculative on our part, but I think that we have a reasonable degree of confidence here that what we're seeing are some strategies that hold a lot of promises. And I think what Julie and I are going to present is really sort of a menu of ideas that we hope the audience will take away. And it's going to be your choice as a leader to think about which of those ideas fit your context, fit your resources, make intuitive sense to you given your organization, your personnel, the pool of people from which you're making those hiring decisions.
A little bit like standards, Joe, if I kind of interpret what your research is, like you got to pull out the parts that connect to your organization and make sure you extend the portability of what the learnings are and apply it in a way that works for your own community. I also know that there was a lot of work beyond you and Julie that were involved in this. Isabel Castilla from Arizona State University, I think she was a doctoral student. Can you mention just what she did to help support your project?
Yeah, Isabella was really central to this project, even though she kind of was working in the background. So when we talk about those 220 agencies that were willing to let us extract their data from Simmers, that's a manual process. So every cell in every table that I mentioned, Isabella had to sit and copy what was in Simmers into a data file for each agency, for each cell, for up to 8 years worth of data. So a lot of work on her part, and to the best of my knowledge, she still has functional eyesight despite spending a lot of months doing that. And also she played a big role in helping do those interviews and analyzing the information we'll share today from those interviews. So we couldn't have done this without her support.
Thank you, Dr. Schaefer. Dr. Hibden, there's some really unique elements to how agencies approach recruitment and retention and promotion processes. So did your research support the idea that some issues and considerations cross into more than one of those areas in any way?
Absolutely. In fact, our research really kind of pointed to three common contextual factors that seem to be influencing recruitment, retention, and promotion. And the first one of those has a lot to do with the current workforce demand, specifically things like early retirements in law enforcement, retaining full career workers, not just within the law enforcement profession, but even outside of the public service sector. And then also, issues with smaller pools of qualified applicants and staff. These are all things that are influencing efforts in these three areas. In addition to that, we noted that within each of the areas, recruitment, retention, and promotion, there was a lot of reference back to issues related to generational differences, specifically changes in expectations of the job, of the work culture, and even differences in who's applying, the reasons that they're applying, the reasons that who's staying and why they're staying, and then also who's willing to engage in promotion. And the last thing that we saw that's kind of across that really is kind of underlying all three areas are issues commonly referred to that we think relate to agency culture. A lot was talked about with respect to transparency of agencies being key, the issues of communication from leadership within agencies, and a lot of the successful departments that we talked to demonstrated very strong, healthy engagement with employees, as well as with the populations that they serve.
I'm always interested about cultural differences among agencies and even across those generational issues you talk about. I'm a lot older than those guys that are serving right now, but I remember during my career, they would talk about, I've only got 12 years to retire, or I've only got 10 years to retire. Well, that's a long time inside the constructs of a career. Did you find that pervasive still, or has that changed, or what's the dynamic there, Dr. Hibden?
So in terms of the agencies that we spoke to, they certainly would kind of, there were times when the people we talked to would refer to officers within their agency that are maybe just kind of, past mid-career and maybe just kind of biding their time. But what was interesting is that a lot of the agencies that we talked to, of course, were those that were kind of demonstrating success. And so there were a lot of efforts to try to keep those workers engaged in the profession to try to kind of mitigate some of that attitude, I guess you would say, regarding, I only have this much time until retirement. I just kind of have to grin and bear it until I'm done.
Yeah, and I bring that up because as I read your white paper, retention is just as important as recruitment because one begets the other. Like you're sneaking up on full staffing, but you can't do that if you can't retain, I guess.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Dr. Schaefer, another issue that kind of weaves these staff considerations is the agency's leadership approach that you've mentioned a number of times to me during discussions. Could you speak a little about that role of leaders and leadership in contributing to successful staffing and really the personnel development efforts associated with that?
Yeah, absolutely, Craig. I think what we were hearing from in both the focus groups and the interviews, which is what's informing a lot of the conversation today, is that the leaders of agencies that seem to be having higher success framed the work that not just they were doing, but their entire leadership team was doing, was trying to build people, that's what our most important role is, building this workforce. And that's not easy, as you've alluded to. Leaders in contemporary agencies often running short-staffed. You have limited time, space, energy, oxygen to do those types of things, to be a servant leader. Sometimes you're just trying to get through the day, much like the personnel on the front line of your organization might be doing. But what we heard about were leaders that were trying to be thoughtful and intentional about that. And to your last comment, Craig, I think a little bit as well, also trying to not apply too much of the thinking that got them to where they are in the organization and presuming that applies to the current workforce. And what I mean by that is not looking at how we handle these issues of recruitment, retention, promotion, staffing, and presuming that the workforce should reflect the values and the behaviors that my peers and I might believe we exemplified when we were starting out our career. So they're trying to look at where that workforce is today and meet that workforce where they are, rather than kind of trying to fit that square peg into a round hole. We're trying to say the workforce is a square peg. We need to adjust our practices. What we also take away from these conversations is, pay and benefits matter, signing bonuses are nice, but as long as agencies, and we can't conclusively absolutely say this in kind of the clear, bright way that as researchers we like to, from a clear causal relationship, but our informal takeaway that Julie and I have is that pay and benefits matter, signing bonuses are great, but you don't have to be the most competitive agency in your region to be successful. People will stay in an organization if it's reasonably competitive, if it's not highly disadvantaged in terms of pay and benefit, if it has a healthy organizational environment. People aren't going to jump ship for a $5,000 or even a $10,000 or $15,000 signing bonus in most situations if they're happy where they're at, if they feel like they're in a good workplace environment, if they feel valued and cared for. And that can extend beyond the employee to thinking about how are we caring for the family of that employee? How are we being mindful and thoughtful about them? And this will come up in some of our later conversations, but thinking about ways to develop employees over the arc of their career. As you noted, Craig, 10, 12 years, people may talk about it like, hey, I can see that light at the end of the tunnel, but that's still something we're measuring in years, in hundreds, if not thousands of shifts that I'm going to work or days I'm going to work. So how can we continue to develop that employee and really be focused on their well-being, thinking about them as a person, even at that recruitment phase, when they're not just simply treating people not simply like a name on a paper application, but thinking about them as a person, not thinking people necessarily are going to need that people don't need to endure maybe how some of us were treated earlier in our careers when we were entering the work profession. And I think public safety agencies beyond just policing, this is a challenge, right? Because historically, public safety in the US, you just kind of let the fish jump in the boat. And that's not been the case in recent years. There's a learning curve in public safety, including in law enforcement agencies, to really figure out how do we do this well. And so leadership is at the center of that. Leaders and their actions can make a huge difference here. Some of those actions might connect with financial costs, but what we'll be talking about throughout the conversation today is also ways that there are things leaders can do that have little or no cost, but can pay substantial benefit for these recruitment, retention, and promotion efforts in an agency.
Joe, that's interesting to me, this whole dynamic difference between generational approaches, because you have people at an agency at any time that have been there 30 years and 30 months and 30 days, right? And so I'm harking back to the days when I first started my public safety career, and there was something called a 1% club. And it was structured so that when anybody retired from the organization, you gave them as a gift 1% of your salary. It's kind of an in-house collective, hey, we appreciate your service with us. And I wonder how those types of things work now as you start talking about benefits, or do you have to hire for the short range as opposed for the long term? Any thoughts on that, Joe, from what you heard?
Yeah, I don't think that, I mean, I think realistically we have to be conscious that some people entering into the labor force today, and that includes, the students that Julie and I see all the time in the classroom, and that includes a lot of kids, nieces, nephews of the people on the line here today. That yeah, they have different values and orientations. And maybe for some of them, it will be a dedicated career that they'll do for 30 years. For others, it may be less that case. And probably everybody on the call can also think of coworkers that they've dealt with over the years that maybe stayed well beyond when they should have. So, sometimes turnover isn't the worst thing in an organization. Some people and some organizations are better when we just have a polite parting of the ways. But I think to your question, we don't have to see this as a 0 or a 1, an all or nothing. But I think we do have to see agencies thinking about how do we provide for that dedicated 30-year career employee, even though they might be walking in the door today as a 22, 24-year-old, and how do we deal with and support the needs of that 22 or 24-year-old that's going to come here and give us 5 really good years and go on and do something else? And how do we make sure that that's mutually beneficial? So there's not, I think, what we see, there's not a one size fits all from what we talk about in the white paper for every agency. And I think, again, to the kind of the leadership challenge is there's probably within any given organization not a one size fits all. I don't think there's a different model for however many employees you have, but there's probably a couple different ways agencies need to think about that employee process and engagement for the duration that somebody's with the organization.
Right. 5 good years may be a lot of quality service, and recognizing the difference and not pigeonholing yourself into thinking you got to have them for 30 years to be successful. Kind of a takeaway from this research, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I think partly and that's not to say that there's not some loss of knowledge and skills and some financial circumstances that go along with needing to replace somebody in that position every 5 years, but partly, yeah, if it's a realignment of what our expectations are, that we're not maybe going to retain our entire workforce each for 25 or 30 plus years. We're going to do that some of the time, and some of the time we're going to get 5, 6, 8 good years and move on. And if we can continue to get good years out of people, that may be okay in kind of the current organizational work environment, the labor force environment that we're dealing with. Absolutely.
not being scared off by findings about that and pre-employment, structuring the interview questions, the background investigations around that awareness. Thanks, Joe.
Absolutely.
So we hear a lot about the importance, again, Joe, and you alluded to this, of pay and benefits in attracting and retaining workers in careers in public safety. And so your findings provide some important insights into how we think about salary, the signing bonus issue, retirements, and other parts of employee compensation. Dr. Hibden, I'm interested, can you possibly speak a bit more to the role of pay and benefits in contemporary personnel management from your findings?
Sure, absolutely. And a lot of what I'm going to say is just reiterating kind of what Joe already talked about. Our findings really kind of point to this idea that pay and benefits are certainly important, and agencies need to be competitive in that area, but they don't necessarily need to be the top paying agency in their area in order to have success with recruitment, retention, and promotion. In fact, what we kind of heard consistently is that the key is having reasonable and competitive pay coupled with healthy work environments. So pay and benefits are relevant, but other things like employee wellness and support, career development opportunities, strong, healthy work cultures, all tend to kind of mitigate retention losses as people want to be in departments where they're valued and supported, while also being appropriately compensated. And so, pay and benefits are very important. And it's definitely, it's interesting because all of the focus groups that we held in terms of kind of looking at retention issues, that was the first kind of comment that would come out. But interestingly, as the conversations developed among the participants, this is kind of the underlying sentiment of those in the room, was that yes, pay and benefits are important. Yes, we have to be competitive in this area. Yes, it's important that people have appropriate compensation for this work. And as leaders, it's important to fight for those issues for your employees. But there's a lot that can be done within the agency outside of pay and benefits that really can make a tremendous difference in these areas.
Yeah, one of those things I noticed in your white paper had to do with like temporary duty assignments, like giving people opportunity to share jobs for short periods of time to give them exposure to different parts of the organization and maybe give them career opportunities beyond patrol or investigations or wherever they might find themselves. Can you speak to that at all, what you learned?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Some of the agencies that we talked to that had demonstrated success, especially when talking about promotion and even retention, was that they talked a lot about how they would allow patrol officers, newer officers even, to shadow for 2 weeks in a particular area, or to kind of be reassigned for a short-term period, 6 weeks or so, into some of these roles where they could kind of experience some of these different roles within police organizations. And the idea is that would, help reduce boredom with the job, complacency, those types of issues, as well as generate excitement among those officers of the different career paths that are available within these agencies. And even get them kind of thinking early on about promotion and why I should be interested in promotion and why this is something that I might want to do later down the road. And so it really was meant to, in the agencies that utilize that, it was really to kind of help officers see all of the things that the agency could provide in terms of a career, and allow them really kind of the experience before they committed into a shift change or into an assignment change, because sometimes within agencies that comes with some sacrifice after you've been on patrol for a long time, or after you've made it to day shift, or whatever the case may be. And so the agencies that talked about that really kind of highlighted how that's been successful in kind of generating interest, retention, as well as more interest in promotion down the road.
Yeah, it's a tough place to be because agencies are asked to work smarter and more effective and conserve their resources. But at the same time, too much of that conservation can take away from the quality of the progression of employees. So I guess there's a balancing act in there from what you learned. So we also hear a lot these days about employee wellness. Public safety careers in general expose employees to a lot of direct and vicarious trauma, whether if they're a telecommunicator or a police officer or something in between all that. Employees have to work shifts at times and can create demands and strains on their workers as well as their families. And Dr. Schaefer, you mentioned this. How does your research position employee wellness with contemporary public safety approaches? What did you learn?
Yeah, I think, clearly we hear a lot in the last 10 or 15 years about well-being and employee wellness. And, that can encompass a lot of different dimensions. Often our initial thought is mental and physical well-being, but it can also extend out into, family well-being, financial well-being, things like that. I think some on the call may have started their career when there was more of an older school mentality about this, that cops don't let things get to them or that you just kind of walk it off. And I think what we recognize is that probably the people that said that that was what they were doing probably were, if we want to talk like academics here, maladaptive coping, right? They were using a lot of negative strategies to deal with the trauma they were seeing on the job. You can't just pretend the things that officers are experiencing aren't a problem. And I think even more so, younger officers and those rising into the workforce are really tuned in on this. I think I've got college age kids, and their drives, their motivations, they're willing to work a good 40-hour work week for a job, but they're not particularly interested in going beyond that. I'm not that way. I'm always willing to do a little bit more and work a little bit of overtime or whatever the analog may be for us in academia. But younger personnel care about their well-being. They care about work-life balance in ways that's different from earlier generations. And that means we have to do more than just kind of have a poster on the bulletin board in our briefing room or hanging up by the mailboxes for the city or the county EAP. We really have to show people we care. We have to work to destigmatize help seeking when it's necessary. We need to be really checking on employees. Craig, I had a student in a class that I was teaching a master's level class last fall on public safety leadership. And it was actually a lot of folks who were rising in fire service. And I had a student that had a family crisis occur midway through the course. And so he and I made some arrangements to kind of remedy that situation and get him through the class on an alternate timeline. And when he turned the paper in at the after the holidays, and a couple weeks later after the grade had posted, he reached back out to me and he said, I really want to thank you for doing this. And I'm telling this story not to pat myself on the back, but to illustrate something. He said, you and I probably traded 3 or 4 emails with this guy, gave him a little bit of encouragement, told him to deal with his family needs before anything else, to prioritize spending time with his family. And we touched base maybe by an 8-minute Zoom conversation at one point. So I probably spent 20 minutes over the course of 2 months interacting with this guy. And he said, I really appreciate what you did. I've interacted more with you on this personal family crisis than I have with anybody in my agency's leadership team. And again, I say that not at all to pat myself on the back, but to say, how striking is it that a professor that traded a few emails and had an 8-minute conversation showed this firefighter more care for his personal well-being than his agency's command staff, who knew him, who lived in the same town with him, all of these things. So we really have to think about how we're caring for employees. And that's difficult, again, when leaders are juggling a lot, when agencies are short-staffed. But I think our takeaway is that it's even more important when those things are going on, because personnel are working overtime, they're working short-staffed, they're handling higher case and call volume. We really have to be thinking about it. We have to be thinking about how we layer resources to meet the needs, how we work to make sure we have good service providers in place that understand the world of law enforcement personnel, that understand the dark humor that sometimes goes along with the job, the sarcasm that goes along with the job, and can work with them in that situation. And leaders need to be leading from the front. We heard from leaders who talked about their efforts to be very upfront and transparent, to talk about how they had sought help, how they had sought medication, how they themselves had sought counseling as a way to advocate for their personnel and lead from the front. And as the framing of your question alludes to, Craig, not just thinking about sworn personnel, but thinking about others, communication personnel who come into contact with a lot of trauma, detention or jail personnel, records and clerical staff that might be handling sensitive information, seeing sensitive images and materials, hearing sensitive interviews and reading sensitive reports. But really thinking about this again, as a leader, how am I holistically leading from the front on this issue to watch out for the well-being of my personnel?
Sometimes, Joe, the application of standards helps a lot on this, but sometimes the implementation of those is difficult. Like for the early intervention programs, sometimes we get hung up on pretty trivial measures to determine when that happens. But there's other measures out there that may have impact too, like number of calls received regarding death or injury, number of times with hours with in custody personnel or in custody subjects and those types of things. So I'm guessing that maybe embedded within the constructs of our standards, if you will, there's some solutions there, but you have to think creatively to identify those to make them most effective.
Yeah, absolutely. Not just thinking about early warning or early intervention systems as purely being things focused on misdeeds and misconducts, but as you're suggesting, also thinking about when is this the third suicide run this person has handled in the last 12 months? When is this, all the tragic things that personnel experience, and do those precipitate some type of check-in, or can we move around in some situations who handle certain things to keep some people out of the fray and the fire a little bit more from time to time? Absolutely.
You got to get good ones and you got to keep them. So let's start unpacking this just a little bit if we can from the research. It makes sense to me to start with the process of recruiting and screening new officers into the workplace. So Dr. Hibden, can you walk us through some of the key recommendations in your report and maybe how should agencies be thinking about the recruitment and hiring process to achieve successful outcomes?
Absolutely. So we heard overwhelmingly from agencies that the recruitment climate is much different today in the past, and I know we've talked a lot about this already. But it also has prompted a lot of the agencies that we talked to kind of get creative with some of the solutions that they've been implementing. And so this is just kind of a summary of some of the practices that we've heard there. I'll also just kind of offer the caveat that we recognize that a lot of agencies might be limited by human resource constraints or civil service requirements, union contracts. But we hope that some of the things that we mentioned here might still be feasible given some of those limitations, and even variations of some of these suggestions. So some of the practices that we saw emerge from the research included things like utilizing officers and officer experiences for recruitment. So a lot of times agencies would have programs where officers acted as recruiters when they were out. They handled a call and they interacted with someone in the course of that call and given the way that they handled themselves and their disposition, said, hey, have you ever thought of a career in law enforcement, kind of a thing. Different initiatives that really allowed officers to pass along recruitment materials to people that they thought exhibited skills that are critical for good law enforcement, like communication, service orientation, those types of things. Some agencies even talked about offering referral bonus programs for their employees in recruiting successful applicants. Additionally, we heard a lot from successful agencies about the use of high touch, high engagement efforts during the recruitment process. A lot of agencies talked about tactics that they used where they made themselves available, as well as frequent initiated communication with recruits and being transparent about the expectation and of the job, and as well as the hiring process for the agency. Things like texting recruits every week or two with updates, offering ride-alongs, agency tours, allowing them to talk to younger officers as well as more seasoned veteran officers. All of those things really meant to kind of help generate excitement for those recruits, as well as communicate that the agency is actively interested in having them on board. Another practice that was highlighted were efforts to streamline and shorten the application process for interested applicants. As many of us know, traditional testing and screening practices can be very cumbersome and very time consuming. And many recruits are not willing, or in many cases, not able to wait that lengthy amount of time to hear back on job opportunities. And so a lot of times successful agencies would point to different efforts to combine testing, maybe into one weekend, which would allow them to identify top candidates very quickly and even make provisional officers pending background checks and other things, essentially reducing that hiring timeline by several weeks and sometimes even months. And connected to this, agencies also talked about efforts to get new hires on the payroll while they're waiting for the academy. Depending on academy cycles and when hiring cycles occurred, sometimes there were lengthy times that recruits or new hires would have to wait before they would be engaged in this work. And the agencies that kind of utilized this practice talked about how it allowed them to really lock in the candidate. And the way that they talked about doing this was considering where these new recruits might be useful in the agency. It might require different classifications and pay scales, and they're certainly not going out and doing the face-to-face work of law enforcement, but there might be other areas within the agency where they could get some of that training, start doing some of the other types of work that's necessary to kind of get them engaged in the process a lot sooner. We also heard about collaborative efforts or initiatives to engage with peer agencies to pool resources for recruitment and hiring. So think about things like hiring collectives. So where you have multiple agencies that come together, they have shared standards for hiring and testing, and then applicants then really only have to do one application to apply for multiple opportunities with multiple agencies. Thinking about this might allow for better marketing of these job opportunities, as well as turnout of potential recruits and cost savings for agencies by not having to duplicate efforts. And then finally, another thing that we heard about were strategies that were aimed, and I know Joe talked about this a little bit, to really integrate families of the applicant or recruit into the hiring process. So asking families if they want to come in to do an agency visit, asking spouses if they're interested in a ride along, facilitating connections to the agencies, allowing them to meet with, like having meet and greets with leadership, coworkers, all of this really being offered to for a couple of reasons, specifically demystifying some of the things, the negative aspects that we often hear about police work, like risk of injury, scheduling barriers, things like that, which are typically really significant concerns for families.
That's good information, Julian. Thanks for bringing that to our attention. But Joe, when we talk a little bit about recruitment and retention, it gets kind of lumped under an umbrella sometimes, but they're different, right? And sometimes the retention piece can be a bit of an afterthought. You talked a little bit about you use focus groups at CALEA conferences to get a handle on some of this stuff. Can you lay out some of the key strategies for retention success you found in your research?
Yeah, absolutely. And you kind of alluded to this earlier, Craig, that if we tend under the umbrella of recruitment and retention literature, a lot of what we see, a lot of what we hear, a lot of what we read is really on recruitment, and retention is sort of this afterthought. But if we're pouring water into a bucket full of holes, we're never going to get ahead in that situation. And so retention is kind of patching those holes, trying to stem that outflow. We hear a number of important themes out of those focus groups, and some of these we've kind of alluded to already. This really focusing on how we build people, build their competence, build their skill set, and then Julie already mentioned, temporary duty assignments and job shadowing as a way to help people both build their skill set, but also to keep them invigorated, engaged, committed to the organization. We had one agency that even talked about a sabbatical program they have where I think it was every 7 or 8 years, a person got 4 weeks off over and above their annual leave. And using that as a chance to give people an opportunity to reinvigorate, to recharge a little bit and things like that. a lot of this came down to thinking again about leadership. How do we make this part of our routine practices? So agencies and those focus groups talked about, we make this part of the annual review process. So the annual review process is really trying to hang some meat on and put some sincerity behind employees laying out goals and talking with their direct supervisor about what needs to be done to achieve those goals. And that's partly on the employee to achieve those goals, but also partly on the supervisor or the organization. And a lot of agencies might do that as part of kind of a concluding conversation in annual review. But what we heard about was really trying to make that a real thing, really trying to push employees to articulate, some stretch goals, some realistic goals, and really seeing the agency trying to do what they could to help employees realize that. And that could be these temporary duty assignments. That could be trying to prioritize training opportunities and ensuring that people have at least opportunities to get some of the special training they want over their career. And what we heard as well was, there may be some hesitancy or fear in taking that type of approach that, well, we're not going to be able to give everybody everything they want. We're not going to be able to support every goal that people want to achieve. But what we really heard was not letting the fear of not being 100% stop you from doing something where you might be able to have 85% success. And that's still really valuable. And it may be better to be at an 85% success rate than not doing that at all. We heard as well about relaxing things like grooming standards, rethinking beards, facial hair, tattoos, rethinking aspects of the uniform. So setting aside polyester dress shirts and pants for cargo slacks and a polo shirt and things like that. And again, somewhat of a generational thing. It doesn't always meet the image that some of us with a little more gray hair may have in our mind when we think about a professional, well-dressed patrol officer. But probably the public, and there's some research evidence that backs this up, the public cares a lot less often about these things than police leaders in positions to make these decisions care about this. So the rationale that the public won't see us as professional if we soften or lean into something a little more breathable and comfortable, there's actually research that suggests that's often not the case. We might also think about how we can quantify aspects of our retention problem. So can we do a little bit to build on the data we're collecting through CALEA to really quantify between recruiting, screening, hiring, training, equipping new officers, as well as the skills and competency we lose with retention, thinking about how retention issues might be costing us overtime because we're chronically understaffed. If we can back of the envelope even some of those costs and take that to city or county leadership, we may be able to convey that, look, if we don't fill some of the holes in the bucket through some of these other initiatives, we're wasting money here. We're being, pound foolish to save a few pennies over here. Let's think about this and use data to our advantage, as well as being creative about these approaches. So, these ideas of sabbaticals, temporary duty assignments, even when we're short-staffed, the cost of those may actually not be that substantial. And the burden that might place on officers to let one person from their squad rotate out for 2 weeks, people may be willing to shoulder that extra call volume burden or case volume burden, knowing that they're eventually going to get their turn in that situation. So being open, being creative, thinking a little bit more expansively can pay a lot of dividends for us with retention.
Joe, I don't want to overstate this in any way, but we often talk about succession planning for leadership, but we don't talk about it often for people in non-leadership roles. But it sounds like to me that open, candid discussions with employees about what their short and long-term goals are important as you start to navigate recruitment and retention issues. Does that resonate with you or no?
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about that, and these special duty assignments can be an opportunity to to kind of get a better sense of who might be the better candidate for a special assignment that might be opening up, or understanding, employees may not be fully transparent about their aspirations or intentions to leave the organization, and that's okay. But sometimes they might be willing to be a little bit more honest, and they might be willing to be honest about what it would take to keep them a little more content and keep them in that organization a bit longer. And those conversations might also inform bigger systemic issues that leaders can take, again, to city and county leadership to say, look, we're losing people because we're not doing X, or we could be doing Y. We have actual, we're not speculating about that. We've determined that this is on the mind of 18% of our officers, our deputies, and that we might be at a risk of losing them. What's that going to cost versus what will it cost to to fix that hole in the bucket?
A whole nother animal, but kind of tertiarily connected to this, is the concept of promotion. And I used to work in an organization that people liked their special assignments, and they didn't want to leave special response, or they didn't want to leave youth investigations, or whatever it was, to take other advancements in the rank system, if you will. Dr. Hibden, what are some of the things agencies can do to create more successful promotional cultures based on the research you've conducted?
Sure. And we heard a lot of those same sentiments, even in the conversations that we had, with certain officers just not wanting to leave their assignment because they were pretty happy where they were. But I think it's worth mentioning, before I kind of point to some of the suggestions, that the principles that we heard about relating to promotional opportunities was very similar to what we heard related to recruitment. A lot of what we heard was related back to efforts of the agency in being transparent about these processes, and also providing high-touch feedback and support during these processes. So, for instance, some of the things that emerged from the study to help with promotion efforts include things like efforts to try to help make everyone qualified. So agencies really kind of considering about how to not just create opportunities for promotion, but to consider offering officers situational leadership positions that have a bit of a safety net prior to an actual promotion. The agencies that engaged in this talked about how it allowed them to provide coaching and mentorship to officers who are kind of trying on some of these leadership roles, but also allowed them to the employees to experience leadership positions and help build confidence that they would do well in those roles. Another thing that was talked about was strategies to identify those who are eligible for promotion through merit versus seniority or favoritism. And a lot of agencies have kind of changed their approach to this in the last couple of decades, where it used to always be about seniority, and we're seeing more of a shift towards merit. But that was just kind of reinforced in our conversations. And sometimes we understand this as a function of civil service rules or union contracts, and it can be really difficult to change. But if possible, agencies might want to consider ways to emphasize competency and growth potential in their promotional decisions. So when a promotional decision is made and those factors are at play, it's really important that transparency is kind of there. In addition to that, encouraging promotion and advancement among officers. Oftentimes, officers self-select out of advancement, and we kind of have already talked about this a little bit. But it's important for agencies to kind of consider how to concentrate the efforts of leadership to encourage officers to consider promotion and to actually see themselves in these leadership roles. People self-select out because of a whole host of reasons. And so even as I think Joe kind of alluded to, being able to understand what some of those reasons are that people aren't willing to even consider the promotional process are important, and then kind of working to address some of those barriers. And then the last thing, again, is supporting officers as they're preparing for promotional testing. We heard a lot from successful agencies, especially where they were seeing higher numbers of underrepresented populations within their leadership ranks. A lot of those agencies were doing things to make the process more transparent to those who were interested in promotion. promotion. For example, things like example exams, explanation or guidance on the assessment test, transparency about the testing process and the selection process. All of those things were mentioned by multiple agencies that participated in the study.
You know, your work collectively has been wonderful for CALEA, and we've got just a few minutes left. I hate to push you on this, but you know, I'm always that guy that wants to boil it down to a couple of tactile things that people can do. So if you had to do that, can you give us quick takeaways for the audience, Dr. Hibden? What would it be?
Sure. So again, I'm going to kind of hammer on this high touch now, because as I said, it's something that we really saw as being important across all areas: recruitment, retention, and promotion. So high touch involvement by the agency and leadership within the agency is critical for successful hiring, retention, and promotional outcomes. The second thing I would say is that agencies might really want to consider if the efforts that they're using in these areas adhere to these ideas of transparency, which really is a great indication of agency culture and the health of an organization. And the last thing that I would say is that recruits and employees want to feel valued at all stages. This is what we heard kind of consistently throughout this process. And so agencies might really want to consider ways that this can be done and foster this type of mentality within the workplace culture.
Thanks, Dr. Hibden. Dr. Schaefer, same question. Give me 2 or 3 things that you think your research boils down to for agencies to take away.
Yeah, leaders have more influence than they might think. And leaders and leadership, not just top leaders, but the entire structure of your ranked personnel. Leaders and leadership matter. Your culture matters. So being able to show that you care about people, you're thinking about their development matters. Well-being and work-life balance are clearly important to young and the rising generation of officers. So setting aside whatever mindsets, values, orientation we might have had early in our careers and really trying to meet people where they're at. And we struggle with the same thing, full disclosure, in higher education as professors, to meet youth today where they are rather than where we like to imagine we were at 18 or 19 years old. And building people and that, building them, developing them, and all employees, not just sworn personnel, but other support staff. They matter a tremendous amount. Their contentment and their retention is really important in the organization as well.
Well, thank you, Dr. Schaefer. As we wrap up today's webinar on recruitment and retention, I want to extend my thanks to our guests, Dr. Hibden and Dr. Schaefer, for sharing their insights from their research. Your contributions have provided us with a deeper understanding of the challenges and best practices in attracting and retaining qualified personnel in the public safety industry. For those who want to delve a little deeper into the topic, you can access the white paper resource by scanning the QR code or by following the link provided in the chat. Thank you all for your participation and engagement. We look forward to continuing this important conversation and working together to support the success of public safety professionals through CALEA accreditation. It is the gold standard. Thanks for your attendance today.